the second time, and then a third time. And when you're done washing your hands, then you make a benediction or a blessing. And if you haven't made that blessing, you haven't actually fulfilled the ritual of washing the hands. And therefore, if you are a believing Pharisee, Orthodox Jew, you cannot eat bread until you fulfill that ritual. So the blessing is, which means, blessed art thou, Lord, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, commanding us to wash the hands. And once you've made that blessing, then you can go ahead and eat bread. Now, I grew up with this ritual on a daily basis, and I, at one point, went to my rabbis and I said to them, where are we commanded in Scripture to wash our hands? Right? I'm saying this blessing every single day, several times a day. Where are we commanded to wash the hands? And they told me very readily, they said, we're not actually commanded in Scripture to wash our hands. However, we are commanded in Scripture to obey the rabbis, and the rabbis command us to fulfill this ritual. I said, where are we commanded to obey the rabbis? And they said, oh, stop asking so many questions. And it's very interesting. In the New Testament, you have a reference to this ritual. This appears in Matthew chapter 15, verses 2 to 3. This is one of the things that sparked my interest in the study of the New Testament. You might think, well, what is this Jew interested in the New Testament at all? Like, what does it have to do with you? Well, first of all, I got a secret to tell you. The New Testament wasn't written by a Christian. The New Testament, most of the books, maybe all the books in the New Testament, were written by Jews. And so when I look at the New Testament, first of all, I'm looking at ancient Jewish literature, just like I look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the things I was privileged to have worked on at the Hebrew University was the Dead Sea Scrolls. I translated some of the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls Reader and worked on various other projects related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. When I read those scrolls, I burst with emotion. Even though you may not know this, but the scrolls were written by a group of Jews called the Essenes. And the Essenes were one specific denomination, one specific group of Jews. Today there are no more Essenes. They have ceased to exist. And they had some peculiar rituals of their own. I won't go into the details, but they had all kinds of certain rituals and certain beliefs that were very peculiar to them. And even though I'm not in a scene, I just get so emotional when I read this ancient Jewish documents that have been preserved out in the Judean desert down to modern times. And when I read the New Testament, that's the same reaction I have, especially when I read it in the Hebrew. We'll talk more tomorrow about the Hebrew. And when I read something like this, I understand exactly what it's talking about, because this is part of my own experience. I think a lot of Christians read this and they've, what is he, washing the hands, traditions of the elders, what is this about? This wasn't some theoretical thing I read about in a book. This is something I experienced in my daily life. Let's look at this passage. The Pharisees, we read earlier, come to Jesus, Yeshua, and they say, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. They don't wash their hands before they don't do the ritual and say the blessing before they eat the bread. He responded, and he answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? He was saying, you have this tradition of the elders, this thing that the Pharisees have invented and made up and imposed upon the people, these yokes, these burdens they put on the people. That's not the commandment of God. That's something that's in and of itself is a transgression of the commandment of God. And when I read this in the New Testament, he could have written this today. In fact, it was still relevant to me, even though I understand from speaking to Christians that this is something that most Christians have no idea, what the ritual involved is. They think, well, what's wrong with washing your hands? I tell my kids to wash their hands before they eat. But if you use soap, you actually haven't fulfilled the ritual. You have to do it according to that specific manner with the jug and the benediction. If you use soap, it's invalid. It has nothing to do with physical cleanliness. This has to do with Pharisaical concepts of ritual cleanliness. And it's very interesting. My first degree, my bachelor's degree, was in both biblical studies and archaeology. And one of the things I studied in archaeology was all these bathing pools that they found from the Second Temple period in Israel. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem, the ruins of Jerusalem from the Second Temple period, or especially Qumran, the place where many of the Dead Sea Scrolls was written, the tour guides will show you there's a mikveh, and there's another mikveh, and every 3 feet is another mikveh. A mikveh was an ancient ritual bath. They were constantly immersing themselves and washing themselves, and it's natural to think, they were very clean. not be an accepted ritual. Where I come from in the United States, and even in Israel, it's very common. Well, in ancient times, they would wash themselves every day in these ritual baths, in these mikvahs, and you would think they would be clean from that. Well, in Qumran recently, they excavated the latrine where the people would go when they needed to relieve themselves. And what they found is all of the people in this small, or most of the people in the small little community of Qumran who washed themselves every single day were infected with bacteria that caused side effects that I will probably get in a few hours having drunk the water here. They were chronically infected with diarrhea because they were washing themselves every day in the same water, and that water was not changed, and the water was filthy. So you think, you wash yourself, you do a ritual like this, that should clean you. A ritual like this actually might make you sick, because it's not a ritual with soap. It's a ritual that has to do with certain actions done by rote in order just to fulfill this tradition of the elders. And it itself is a transgression of the commandment of God. And when I read something like this, from speaking to Christians, I realize that many Christians are missing a piece of the puzzle, understanding what a Pharisee is. Because Pharisees haven't disappeared. I was raised as a Pharisee. My father is, as I mentioned, an Orthodox Jew. And in the writings of the rabbis, like my father, their sacred writings say, and I'm not talking about the Bible, the Talmud, refers to the ancient rabbis up until the time when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 as Pharisees. That's what they refer to. I won't go into all of what that means. It has to do also with ritual cleanliness. Said it would end at 9. I don't know if that's going to happen. Okay. Let me quickly explain to you the 5 fundamental principles of Phariseeism. I think that's extremely important. That's both to understand the incidents in the New Testament where it mentions Pharisees, but also to tell you about my own background. Who I am speaking to you here. This is not something that I read about in a book. This is something that I lived and experienced. And when Jesus was interacting with the Pharisees, this was something that he knew from daily life as well. So the first principle of Phariseeism is that there are 2 Torahs. Keith mentioned before the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5 books in Hebrew are called the Torah. And Torah in English is usually translated as law, but actually Torah in ancient Hebrew means instruction. So this is the instruction. And the most fundamental belief of the Pharisees is that there are 2 Torahs, 2 separate instructions.